Please welcome to the stage Jim Febio, Senior Vice President and Head of Federal Government Relations and Public Policy for Fidelity Investments.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I just am pleased to be here today and have the distinct privilege of introducing Congressman Jim Himes, who represents the 4th Congressional District of Connecticut since 2009. I think most of interest to this audience is his long service on the House Financial Services Committee, but he's also a member of the Intel Committee, and there's no shortage of things going on globally, I guess, and domestically in that space as well. I think less well known, he also chairs the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth, and under his leadership, the committee is studying the causes and consequences of economic disparity and seeking bipartisan solutions. I think what I would note personally from having worked with him and his staff is Congressman Himes and the whole team are really thoughtful in their approach to policy. They really want to understand the impacts on business, investors, and markets. A good example of this, he recently published a white paper, Winning the Future of Money, a proposal for a U.S. central bank digital currency, just as an example. And Chair Gensler was here a little earlier, and with the current SEC agenda, there's certainly no shortage of issues and topics affecting this audience on which we all need to learn more and more deeply and engage on. A few lesser known facts, he is a beekeeper. He taps his maple trees and makes maple syrup. Maybe he has some insights on favorite recipes. And his idea of a fun congressional junket is to spend a night on a nuclear sub. Before I turn it over to him on more serious topics facing us on financial regulation, I would note he's also the recent former chairman of the New Democratic Coalition. As we look at the political dynamics in the market environment, I, for one, would welcome his thoughts on how the influence of that caucus and that coalition and their understanding is aligning with maybe some of the more progressive wing of the party on some of these issues and how it's kind of working behind the scenes and navigating the different interests within the caucus. So without further ado, my pleasure to welcome Congressman Himes.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Straight talk from the. I didn't know this was the title. Straight talk from the Battery. Beltway. I need to maybe rethink my whole conversation here. It's a delight to be with all of you. As the introduction mentioned, just so you know kind of what my perspective is, because you're going to hear. I think you're going to hear from other members of Congress, other senators. Just to locate me so that you understand what you're hearing, I have the honor of representing a place, some of you probably come from there, Fairfield County, Connecticut. We were a Republican, we were a very Republican place for a century and a half until I won in 08. And my predecessors were all moderate, maybe even today, liberal Republicans. I'm a fairly moderate Democrat. And I come from, as you heard, the New Democrat Coalition, which are the sort of centrist, maybe pro-business Democrats. And so I just want to locate you on that spectrum because you'll hear from a lot of different people. It is a thing here to use talking points. If you hear from a Republican, you're going to hear what a catastrophe the Biden administration is and how everything is dying because of overregulation. And if you hear from a Democrat, you're going to hear the Democratic talking points. Again, that thing says straight talk. So I'm going to try to give it to you, give you a perspective down, more or less down the middle. We'll see if I can succeed at that. I'm also delighted to be following Gary Gensler. I understand you heard from the chairman this morning. I have been following him around for some time. We were at Goldman together. He was a lot more senior than I was. We did some nonprofit work together. And right now, the work that he's doing, particularly in cryptocurrency, is creating a lot of pressure on the Congress to act on creating the legal framework for cryptocurrencies. But let me step back for a second here. And as I was reflecting on talking to you guys, and I'm going to try to be disciplined on the time so that we've got plenty of time for Q&A, I was sort of trying to decide what story to tell because I'm a little mixed up in my own head right now. I just did 3 town hall meetings in my district, and I realized that, and I will stand by this statement, our politics are really very badly broken right now. Badly broken. I've been in Congress now for 14 years, and because of January 6th and everything associated with it, the personal relationships on the Hill are more damaged than at any time I remember. It used to be a thing, prior to the last, well, certainly January 6th and everything that led up to it. there was sort of a Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote flavor to the Congress, meaning that when the cameras were running, we all sort of ran our talking points and attacked each other. But when the workday was over, we clocked out and we were friends. And that's still true to some extent. But January 6th was really a very painful moment for a lot of us. I was in the chamber that day. I didn't know how horrible the things that were happening outside were. But that sort of changed things in the Congress. So I could tell that story. Or I could tell the other story, and I'm having a little trouble reconciling this in my own head. I could tell you the story of an awful lot of bipartisan progress made in the last couple of years. And I think I can substantiate that. And I know you're particularly interested in the committee's action. And weirdly enough, I think I can make an argument to you that the committee has been pretty bipartisan. But I'm going to focus on that second story because I hope that's where the future lies. And again, when I was preparing for my town hall meetings, I sort of started thinking about this, and I thought, my gosh, we've actually been in the most polarized Congress ever. We've actually been really productive on things that are by and large bipartisan. So the infrastructure bill, right? I mean, I expected that to get done during the Trump administration. I figured if President Trump was going to do one thing, he was going to do infrastructure, but for a whole bunch of reasons, it didn't get done. We made the biggest investment we've made since the Eisenhower administration in our infrastructure, which if you come from my neck of the woods, that's really, really important to the economic vitality and the quality of life of people living there. That was bipartisan, right? We passed the CHIPS Act. You're familiar with that. That's a profound investment in research and development and, by the way, interestingly enough, industrial policy around semiconductors. I've been around long enough to know that I never imagined that I would see particularly my Republican colleagues supporting industrial policy, but what we saw in the pandemic with respect to the weakness of our supply chains created real bipartisan support for this very substantial piece of legislation. We passed a bill in bipartisan fashion that's going to give our young men and women who are exposed to toxic fumes in burn pits in places like Afghanistan and Iraq access to VA services. I could go on this. By the way, gun safety regulation hadn't been done in 30 years, and it got done in bipartisan fashion. If, like me, you think we could do more in that arena, you said that wasn't enough, but this is sort of the nature of the Congress. The one thing, of course, that got done that was not bipartisan, pretty big, was the oddly named Inflation Reduction Act. That was not bipartisan, but I watched my Republican colleagues try to attack lowering drug costs for senior citizens through Medicare, attack a major investment in addressing climate change. They sort of focused on the IRS side of things. But again, though it was not bipartisan, it had broad support amongst the American public, which is why you don't hear a lot of conversation of that particular bill in the Congress. But so I think I can substantiate my observation that in this most polarized of political moments, we're actually getting some stuff done, and a lot of it in bipartisan fashion. And I want to, just because I know it's particularly interesting to all of you, just spend a moment on the committee on which I serve, the Committee on Financial Services. And I think I can hold this up as also an example. Let's start with, and I'll get to Secure 2.0, which is not in my committee, it's in the Ways and Means Committee. But on something that I think at least intrigues all of you, stablecoins and cryptocurrencies and crypto assets generally. 3 years ago, if you had said cryptocurrency in the United States Congress, there probably would have been 3 or 4 members who had any idea what you were talking about. And I'm actually pretty proud of the extent to which this group of 535 people in that 3-year period has actually done a lot of learning about what these things are. You don't see that all that often. Here's a brand new thing with innovative possibilities. Everybody kind of sees the thing in cryptocurrency that they want to see. For one group, it may be disruption of legacy financial players. For another group, it might be the fact that there is a promise that the unbanked population, the marginalized population, there may be fintechs that serve that population. But my point is that in a relatively short period of time, my committee members in the Congress generally has come up to speed, pushed by the excitement about it, but also pushed by our jealousy against a guy like Gary Gensler, right? Gary used to teach cryptocurrencies at MIT, right? He's the most knowledgeable guy on this stuff in Washington, whether you agree with him or not. And there is an institutional jealousy that says, Gensler's way out in front on this stuff. It actually is should be dealt with in statute to create a national level playing field, or at least certainty around a regulatory apparatus. And so that too has sort of resulted in us being where we are, which, as you're probably aware, remarkably, because these two folks are pretty ideologically different, but Maxine Waters, the chairwoman of the committee, and Patrick McHenry, the ranking member, came up with a piece of legislation which has its issues. The Federal Reserve isn't thrilled with it. There's all kinds of issues about state versus federal regulation and what's the role of the Federal Reserve. But here you have, in this very polarized Congress, two people who are radically ideologically different coming together to put forward a piece of legislation. I think most of you know what's in it, right? It would allow for both banks and non-banks to sponsor stablecoins. It would require basically dollar-for-dollar reserves against those stablecoins. Those reserves able to be held at the Federal Reserve, including giving the sponsors access to the window. So not becoming law in the next 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 weeks, but we're off and running on that issue, which again, hopefully will. At the end of the day, the SEC and the CFTC have to respond to what we do in the Congress, and hopefully that between that and a lot of the work that you've seen on the Senate side with people like Senator Lummis and others will eventually sort of clarify who has what jurisdiction, what the rules are around stablecoins, et cetera. We will have the usual regulatory push and pull. I can't tell you where it's going to end up. There is an analogy, I think, to be drawn with stablecoins with money market mutual funds. And I went through those wars back in 2009 or 2010 after Reserve broke the buck. And, so if we under reserve, we'll be back around at some point with somebody who was under reserve, just as we saw with the mutual funds. But my point is, we'll have that push and pull. I do think that sometime in the next year or two, we'll settle on both resolving the jurisdictional questions as well as setting up the structure of reserves and how these things are held and all of that good stuff. One other thing I would mention that is also evidence, actually, of real bipartisan agreement, something you're institutionally very much in support of, is Secure 2.0. Chairman Richie Neal of Massachusetts, as you know, got it through the House of Representatives. Good stuff in there. When we checked with him last week, he's confident that it'll get done in this Congress, in the Senate. That, of course, will hopefully ease the passage for more Americans to invest in retirement accounts, tax-advantaged retirement accounts. This brings me to one thing I did want to mention. Speaker Pelosi asked me to chair a select committee on economic disparity. The title of the committee is the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. Doesn't roll off the tongue easily, but it's a really important topic. And I'm super excited about Secure 2.0, but I continue to be very worried about the fact that we're having a really hard time getting in, let's just draw a line at the mean or median income point in this country. We're having a really hard time getting below that in terms of savings for retirement, savings for anything. And I think that this has political implications too, as I sort of reflect on disparity. I was excited to take Speaker Pelosi up on her offer to chair this committee because, really for 3 reasons. And maybe this is sort of the Democrat in me speaking, but we do see economic disparity in this country that is as intense as it has ever been. That's just an economic fact, with moral implications, of course. If a very narrow sliver of the country is doing extraordinarily well and the middle class is hanging on by their fingernails and below middle class is sort of struggling in intense poverty, that ought to disturb us, even if we have different policy prescriptions as to how to address it. It's also an economic problem. If we're taking half, or pick your number, 2/3 of the US population and undertraining and underemploying them, that has an effect, obviously, on aggregate output, and it makes our economy weaker than it need be. And then lastly, and I'll just close with this point, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the nature and the reasons for our politics being as broken as they are. And I think the reasons are complicated. But I think that the underlying aspect of our broken politics, and when I say broken, by the way, I'm not talking about the usual fight between Democrats and Republicans. I actually think that's a really healthy argument, I should say. I'm talking about a meaningful chunk of the American population not believing that the results of elections are actually valid, despite there being no evidence that they are not. having thought about this for a very long time, I think there's two big things going on. There's a lot of social change. I'm not going to talk about that. The culture wars, right? The country has changed a lot culturally, frankly, from when I was a kid. The way we think about our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, the fact that they can get married today, inconceivable when I was a kid. There's been a lot of social change. And that's dislocating for some folks. And by the way, it's a problem for my party that we sometimes look at that dislocation and call somebody who feels uncomfortable with all that social change, we call them bigoted. That's a real problem, I think, in my party. But I'll set that aside for the moment because the other big piece here is too many people feel like they don't have an economic stake in the system. And I represent some of the wealthiest people in America, in Fairfield County, Connecticut, and I don't think I'm in any way deviating with what a lot of them would think, but when you have a middle class that feels like it's impossible to educate their kids at a time when education is no longer optional, because not only are you competing globally, but you're competing with AI, and God only knows where that's going to take us. At a time when people in the middle class are sort of feeling like they can't afford healthcare, they can't afford education, and by the way, their kids aren't going to do as well as they are going to do, that's a profound problem for the American body politic, right? Because what happens is you start to be attracted to people who say, the problem is that the system is rigged against you. And if you think about those words, that was sort of in some ways Senator Sanders' message. And though he was not the nominee in 2016, he had an awful lot of energy. And of course, that was very much Donald Trump's message. And the more people come to be convinced that the system is rigged against them, the less interest they have in sort of being a constructive part of that system. So I do think, and again, maybe this is the Democrat in me speaking, but I do think we've all got a stake in trying to think of ways to make sure that people have the earning power, the training, and then those products which allow them to save. And I admire what you do because I watch how much we don't want to save, how much we do want to consume rather than save. But I do think that getting that right, allowing more and more people to feel like they've got a shot at getting into and staying in the middle class is going to be the answer to the question of whether this democracy survives in the long run. So thank you so much for inviting me. I see the clock here. I'm leaving ample time for questions of any kind. I also, in addition to economic disparity and financial services, as you heard in the introduction, sit on the Intelligence Committee, so I'm spending a lot of time thinking about Ukraine and China and other stuff, but I'm happy to take questions on any topic whatsoever. And I see Neil wandering around with a microphone there, so I guess that's how we'll find questioners.
Thanks, Congressman Himes. On financial services and perhaps on the intelligence community, our markets are very competitive, which draws capital from around the world. And a lot of companies do business around the world, and the United States has become antagonistic towards other countries in recent times, sometimes for very good reasons, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm wondering how, as investors and investment advisors, we should perceive the risk of discontinuity in markets and confiscation of wealth associated with the United States government restricting access to markets in things like American depository receipts of, for instance, Chinese or other potentially somewhat adversarial economies.
Yeah, great and interesting question. Let me try to draw a distinction between the two obvious suspects right now, which are Russia and China. We could include I don't know if any of you are investing in North Korea or Iran. If you are, it's on you. But you are fiduciaries. But look, there's a purely financial answer to the question, which is, I don't know, maybe it's not insane to invest in, I'm not going to say North Korea and Iran because there's pretty heavy sanction regimes. But there's a risk-return scenario there. What may get swept up, and I remember being a banker myself, what is easily swept up is the reputational risk. And here's where I would draw a distinction between Russia and China. So you're invested in Russia, as many people were. Vladimir Putin, maybe not a huge surprise, but does an absolute near genocidal war crime. And so, of course, we're going to respond. There is not going to be negotiation over the question of whether a European power can go back to 1870 and decide that they're going to be, a great power by invading a neighbor, right? I thought we'd left that behind in the 1930s. And now with the evidence of war crimes and everything else, there's really not going to be negotiation on that topic. And I know people who are invested in Russia, but that's, I guess, one of the risks. But we are going to continue to use those weapons at our disposal, whether they're sanctions or using SWIFT or whatever it is. That's just a fact, and I don't think we should apologize for that in the face of what Vladimir Putin did in Russia and Ukraine. China is a much more interesting, and I would really draw your attention to China because you can paint a picture, a moral picture, as I just did about Russia, about China, if you look at the way they're treating the Uyghurs, if you look at the fact that they steal everything that we have with respect to IP. You can draw that picture if you want. But they're also a remarkable economic success story driven by engagement with the rest of the world. I mean, if you were to sort of collapse 50 years of Chinese economic growth into one sentence, it would be that they became sort of the industrial powerhouse and trading powerhouse to the world. And the implication of that, of course, and I sometimes point this out to my more hawkish colleagues, is don't think about China the way you think about the Soviet Union. Because, by the way, that was happening. That is happening right now in the Congress. There are proposals to cut them off out of global capital markets. The fact they hold $1 trillion of treasury debt notwithstanding, there are some proposals that are misunderstanding what China is to the world economically and to us as a trading partner. So there's an example where I think, though I would be fairly absolute about the treatment and what we would array against Vladimir Putin, here's, I think, an area where we need to be very, very careful. It's not just the $1 trillion in treasuries that they hold, it's the fact that everything we're sitting on and eating from and wearing probably comes to some extent from China. I mean, so we are really closely, $600 billion in trade a year or something. So this is where, at least in my own mind, the calculus needs to become a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit less moralistic, even though we condemn, obviously, an awful lot of what they're doing. We're spending all this time thinking about what a military conflict looks like in Taiwan and not spending nearly enough time thinking about what the economic implications of that are, because it feels apocalyptic to me. Right? If global trade, all of a sudden, if we try to isolate the Chinese, they're isolated, that feels apocalyptic economically. So that's not a precise answer to your question, but to say that that's maybe how one policymaker thinks about the enthusiasm with which you use the many mechanisms at our disposal. And I'll just close by saying one thing. We're not dumb about this, or at least some of us are not dumb about this. The more we use the value or the power of the US dollar as a reserve currency, the more maybe we try to leverage SWIFT or everything. We're aware of the fact that the more you do that, the more not just our enemies, but some of our friends say, hey, it turns out that this piece of the global architecture can easily be used by the United States as a tool for soft power. And that has implications for folks like the EU deciding that they'd like to build competitive whatever it might be, financial architecture.
I have a question about what seems like a likely GOP takeover of the House. And yesterday, Ranking Member McHenry on the Financial Services Committee and other Republicans released their capital formation agenda. And I'm wondering to what extent bipartisanship can be achieved on that agenda. And specifically, they say they want to open private markets to more ordinary investors, including expanding the accredited investor definition to include any person who invests not more than 10% of the greater of his or her annual income or net assets. So what are the chances of working with Republicans there?
Yeah, another great question. I haven't had a chance to look at the Republican release, so let me just address the part you're talking about there. So you're hearing this from a Democrat. I have grown increasingly worried. I've got a lot of friends in venture capital and private equity. I've grown increasingly worried that we are now bifurcating our capital markets, where, and I'll run the numbers on this. Maybe you guys will help me run the numbers on this. But if you're an institutional or an accredited investor and you can invest in a private fund or in a venture capital fund, the returns are pretty spectacular. And then what happens when those returns have been squeezed out? Now that VC or that private equity is looking for an exit, sometimes in the public markets. So again, I don't have the numbers at hand, but I'm growing increasingly worried that your average American investor is getting shut out of the opportunities and the yield that comes from the private world. Now I hear stats that the average private equity fund doesn't over a 10-year period outperform the S&P 500. I got to check my facts on this, but Here's an area where I think you could get a lot of bipartisan support. Now, that doesn't mean I want to abandon, the protections that are out there for retail investors, but this shouldn't be that hard to do, right? You can put limits on the percentage of somebody's net worth that could be invested. By the way, that'll put a hell of a reporting obligation on you guys and the brokers. But there are ways to solve this problem. But your very narrow question about would you find bipartisan support for that, you're hearing from one senior Democrat on the committee, which is yes. I want to make sure that that institutions and accredited investors are not the only folks that have access to what appear to be pretty substantial returns in excess of what you can achieve in the public market. So I haven't read the rest of McHenry's thing. My suspicion is that there's probably some of the, we need to deregulate everything, and oh, by the way, if you don't fund the gun manufacturers, we're going to be very angry. But on that point, I think there would be broad bipartisan support. By the way, on that point, because you guys get caught up on this, it's not unnatural for those of us on the left maybe to try to use every tool at our disposal to, advance whatever our goal may be, whether it's climate change or social equity or guns or petroleum or whatever. It is kind of weird when the right, who has always sort of dedicated itself to free markets, when they start saying, well, Blackstone, if you're not going to fund gun manufacturers, you can't do business in Texas. My hope is, and maybe this is a little counterintuitive for a Democrat, but my hope is that we don't go there too much. We've now opened the doors to, if you watch the CEOs of the big banks in front of the two committees, we've now opened the doors to, elected officials just pounding on commercial entities for their policy choices, if you will. And you sort of ask yourself, well, where does that stop? And the détente I might hope we might reach, and again, I would have people well on my left who would be angry for me saying this, is the détente I hope we might reach would be they're private entities. So long as they're not breaking the law, they should do what is legal for them to do, and whatever their stakeholders, by which I mean their customers and their employees, want them to do. That's enough to manage without guys like me breathing down their neck.
Okay, Peter?
Thank you for speaking today. I have never seen a person come out of Congress poorer than they were when they went into Congress. So would you address the whole issue of kind of insider trading regarding proposed regulations and that such ilk for a few minutes, please?
By the way, you can't, having seen me, you can't make that statement anymore. When I was appointed to the financial services, so I worked at Goldman, right? And I had a fair amount of Goldman stock. And if you want to know the day that I sold my stock, look at the 15-year stock price, and like that low is when I sold. It's been wonderful for capital losses for a good long time. So this is a very small. I'm going to be very straight with you. It's a very small problem, really. They've floated legislation just last night. First of all, we almost never get inside information. Almost never. I can't think, I've been doing this for 14 years, I can't think of a time when I knew before the market did that some regulation was coming down. Maybe it happens every once in a blue moon. If you're very senior on the Energy and Commerce Committee and the chairman is about to announce a hearing with the pharmaceutical CEOs and that's not going to be happy for 2 days in the stock market. But we almost never get inside information. There are some celebrated cases where, Senator Burr and a few others, whatever. There are some celebrated cases where you wondered, but nobody's been prosecuted. So anyway, I'm not going to say it's not a problem. I'm going to tell you it's a small problem. Now, by the way, the reason I sold my Goldman stock when I went on the committee was I didn't want even the appearance of a conflict of interest, and I don't invest in individual stocks anymore. I think that's the right behavior. But I hear a lot of stuff out there like members of Congress don't, they get Social Security even though they don't pay for it. They have health care for life. Neither of those things are true. And while I think it's unseemly that members would trade individual stocks, there will almost always be an appearance of conflict of interest. I would tell you it's a small problem, not a big problem. And whether we get richer or not is probably purely a function of what our mutual funds do. I mean, there's some very wealthy members of Congress. It hasn't been a bad run, these last 15 years or so in the stock market, but it's a matter of public record. We make $174,000 a year, and we're not really allowed to take other income outside of that money. So whenever you see members of Congress getting wealthier, it's probably because you guys are doing a pretty good job for them.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm from the great state of Maine, where we too also make pretty good maple syrup, so hope you had a good March. This is really sort of an open-ended question, and I appreciate your candor. You are a little bit of a unicorn, I guess, in the political sphere, where you're a moderate Democrat. Maybe you've got some friends who are moderate Republicans, I'm not really sure. But once again, as in the public world, it seems very difficult for us to comprehend that things could really be accomplished in one of the most divided Congresses that certainly I've ever seen. You had talked about this a little bit earlier in your discussion, but if you could just elaborate on giving us a sense as to, is there reason for any optimism?
Yeah, what a great question from somebody from Maine, where you've got an independent senator and probably the most conservative House member in Jared Golden. So let me say two things about that. First of all, please abandon this ridiculous meme that what you really need to do is stop thinking about your party and start thinking about America. That's baloney. We respond to the incentives that are there, just the way everybody does, the way you do. So we have a structural problem here. And by the way, Maine has really gone down the path of helping solve that structural problem with ranked choice voting, as has New York City, Alaska. There are structural problems in our politics. And we could talk about gerrymandering in the House. That's definitely part of the problem. When my counterparts in state houses get together in the proverbial smoke-filled rooms to try to create safe Democratic districts and safe Republican districts, what happens is November doesn't matter anymore. I feel this because arguably my district is safe Democratic now, but it didn't used to be. And when it didn't used to be, I didn't have to listen to Republicans, I had to listen to Republicans. In a safe district, you don't have to. You don't care about November. Your threat is the primary. So if you're in a very safe district, November does not matter. The primary election matters. And what do primary electorates look like? Anybody who followed the state of Connecticut in the senatorial primary there, where you took Themis Claridis, who was the Republican leader of the Assembly, pro-choice, moderate Republican, got her doors blown off by an individual named Leora Levy, who was a very Trump-oriented person, who, by the way, is going to get crushed in the general election. You see that dynamic. In primaries, you have your most ferocious activist voting. So candidly, in the last 8 years, let's say, I've worried a lot less about November than I have worried about somebody coming up well to my left. Now, all of a sudden, I'm not being quite as frank with you guys because this person is going to say, first of all, he addressed the investment advisors, what a corporate shill. Whatever it is, you can imagine what it is. So the primary structure is a huge problem, but there is a solution. Ranked choice voting helps, what they call jungle primaries. They do this in California, right? You can have 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats facing off in the general election. Funny little side story, I was arguing with Senator Murphy about ranked choice voting, and I closed the conversation. I'll probably irritate some of you with this story, but I closed the conversation with Senator Murphy because our governor came out in favor of ranked choice voting, and it was 2 weeks ago, and I said, well, Chris, here's the thing, 2 days from now, we're going to swear Mary Peralta into Congress to be a House representative for the state of Alaska. Without ranked choice voting, we're swearing in Sarah Palin, Chris. And so, anyway, I tell that story to demonstrate that it is a mechanism to depower the extremes and empower the middle. And here I'm going to really irritate some of you, but I got to say it because it's a meme that drives me crazy. It is true. We're just talking politics here. The sponsors are getting a little nervous. It is true that both parties have drifted away from the center. No question about that. The Democratic Party used to have a lot of hardcore conservatives, primarily in the south of the United States. So it is true that both parties have drifted away from the center. But I really object to, and here's the part that irritates some of you, I really object to the notion that this is a symmetrical problem. And what I mean by that is if you take the 10 most extreme Republicans and the 10 most extreme Democrats, this is not a symmetrical problem. The 10 most extreme folks on the right are out-and-out election deniers who are going to white nationalist conferences. The 10 most extreme Democrats are arguing for single-payer health care, which is way to the right of the National Health Service that is defended by the British Conservative Party. So again, I think, though I know that doesn't land happily on the ears of some right-leaning people, we have a particular problem in this country that is not just about polarization, but is about, something that's scary that's happening way out there on the right wing.
Watch out, she's from Connecticut.
And I'm from your district, so thank you for all that you do for us in Fairfield County. I just wanted to bring it back to the Economic Disparity Committee that you talked about, that you said you were just beginning to work on. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you plan to accomplish?
Yeah, so just in 90 seconds, here's what we're trying to do. We're never going to be smarter than the Brookings Institution or the American Enterprise Institution or the University of Chicago or Harvard on this issue. There's Nobel Prize winning economists who are smarter. Here's what we can do. We can hold up stuff that might actually be impactful because the judgment there is a political judgment. So I think what we're going to center in our recommendations is going to be around probably two big themes that I think draw some bipartisan support. Number one, and this is really important, is investing more in our children. And if my ranking member, Republican of Wisconsin, Brian Stile, were standing here, we would have slightly different views about how to do that, but I think we would both agree that a society that invests, half of its federal budget, that's a little bit off, it's more like 40%, half of its federal budget through Social Security and Medicare in our most elderly citizens and invests a rounding error in our youngest citizens has its priorities a little mismatched. Now, don't get me wrong, there's an election coming up. I'm not saying we mess with Social Security and Medicare. Let me say that again. But the point is there's an obvious mismatch in what we invest. And that investment is arguably more important today than ever before, right? My grandparents, they didn't need your grandparents, they didn't need a college degree, right? They walked down the street to the mill, they got a union job, they worked with their hands, they were middle class. Today, it's not just about college and training, it's about what happens as kids. So I think we're going to find some common ground there. The other area that, just to throw one out there, that I think is really important is housing. People's eyes glaze over pretty quickly, but think about this, right? Where the economic growth is happening, you can't afford to live. If you're not making a six-figure salary, try being near San Francisco or Boston or New York. So we obviously have a major supply imbalance in housing. So this is not necessarily going to be the Democrats saying we should give more money and subsidize housing. It's going to be like, how do we fix the supply problem? It's a thorny one because we don't have a lot of levers at the federal level. A lot of this is sort of municipal and countywide and that sort of thing. But to answer your question, we're going to try to uplift those things that might actually get done regardless of the outcome in November that attract some bipartisan support.
I have a question related to the Intelligence Committee. So in your view, what's the end game in Russia and Ukraine?
I get to see stuff that you don't get to see, but I don't get to see that answer. Candidly, there's a lot of ways it could end. The only graceful way that this ends is if the Russian people, who in the last 72 hours have become aware of how brutal this mistake was and how very much it will affect them, until the Russian people put a stop to this. I don't know what form that takes, but there is a history in Russia of leaders being deposed in one way or another. That's the only way I think this thing ends quickly. There's lots of other ways. Actually, it may be the only way it ends quickly. So our nightmare scenario is, Russian doctrine calls for when things are feeling existential, the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. It's not out of the realm of the possible that, Putin would choose to demonstrate. You don't need to worry too much about, what we worried about in the 70s, an exchange of ICBMs, but you do need to worry about Putin deciding that this has all gone horribly wrong and demonstrating a tactical nuclear weapon over the Black Sea or something. That sort of does that would probably do what it's designed to do, which is sort of bring everything to a screeching halt. Beyond that, it's really unpredictable. But he's doubling down and doubling down. And you all are as smart as I am on this stuff. He's backed himself into a corner that I don't see any exit other than the Russian people deciding that they've had enough.
Okay, one last question from the middle table right here.
I've appreciated listening to you. To give you a little quick history, I am now an independent. I'm not going to say it made me do that. It's my own choice. I happen to be from the state of Arizona. A few years ago, approximately, 4 years ago, I didn't vote for Senator Sinema. I will this time. And let me tell you why, for what it's worth. I don't want a party to tell each of its members how they must vote. I don't want a party that thinks everything's wrong on one side and everything's right on the other. I was with you till a few moments ago, which, as a guest, I'll be nice about it. You talk about extremism, then you said, oh, but the right is white supremacists and the left is this, and conclusion is one is a lot worse than the other. I think both parties are broken until they understand that. I think forcing us to extremism is not right in any way, shape, or form. I think dishonesty in not giving proper facts that support your party or someone else against someone else's party is wrong. Dishonesty is dishonesty. And so I would just say this, and I'm only talking for myself. Everyone in here may disagree. I'm more of a centralist or maybe middle. I don't like extremism. I could get up here and tell you my concerns I have for both sides, and I think they're in trouble. But they just believe the other one's a little worse. And so I'm looking for a congressperson that I suppose most of the time Sinema has not voted exactly what I'd wanted, but she's voted the way she believes. At least I think that. And so I just hope we'll come to a day that we quit blaming one party for all the faults there are. They've caused it all. Or we believe that not telling the truth isn't important. Or we believe that one party is wrong, but the other is wronger. So I just wanted to stand up and say that. And I appreciate what you've said today, and I'm generally not a leader by natural, but I've learned to try to stand up. And I think you said a lot of things right today, and I appreciate it. But I think you took a cheap shot on one thing, and I just wanted to say it, I hope in a proper way, and I don't think it's necessary. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, look, I think that's a really good topic on which to close. At the end of the day, the stability of our democracy it's not in my hands, it's in yours. I said this before, we respond to the incentives in the structure. And that's why I think Maine, and well, I'm not going to say what I've said already, but we can change those structures to depower the extremes and to empower the middle. And I generally share your feelings. Hopefully in the last 40 minutes that we've been talking, you haven't heard me take a cheap shot at the Republicans. In fact, I've held up those things that are bipartisan. We don't have time to do it, but I will defend what I said before. It wasn't an attack on the Republican Party. It was an attack on the lies, because you said you really hate dishonesty. And one of the things that is driving or warping our politics today is a remarkably resilient lie. And that's what put my life at risk on January 6th. And you may not like AOC, you know, because you don't like single-payer healthcare or the Green New Deal, or you may not like Ilhan Omar because whatever. That side did not take a lie and turn it into the first time in 250 years that this country has not achieved a peaceful transfer of power. So, but what I want to leave you with right now is if you do hear a colleague of mine standing in front of you saying it is all their fault, I hope you haven't heard that from me today, but if you do hear them saying that, don't vote for them. Don't vote for them, because nothing that we deal with, almost nothing that we deal with, is that way. It's black. We argue over corporate tax rates and depreciation schedules, and is it HIMARS or you know, other weapons, and none of that stuff is binary, but it's ultimately in your hands. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.